And so this was my process for, as I said, more than a year. And it really was a way of practicing acceptance, but it was also a way of practicing opening a channel, because clearly anyone who has lost a loved one, the big lesson about the loss is a great tutorial about love.
Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. And welcome back to those of you who have been with us before. It's good to have you with us. If you're here for the first time, join us in the flow of synchronicities that are part of what we do here, like this one. After dance last Sunday, I was talking to Josh Silver, who was a guest on my podcast last year. And Josh knows dance very well. He dances a lot and loves it, and is a student of dance. So I can talk to him about what happens. I was telling him about 3 dance experiences while we are on audio on our phones. Each time I began the crescendo into the excitement of the encounter, he lost contact with me. He couldn't hear me. Well, according to Ian Fleming, the author of the James Bond books, it happened once, that's happenstance. Twice is a coincidence. 3 times is deliberate action. So there's something going on here. There's something about my increasing my intensity of emotion that seemed to correlate and maybe cause the cell phone interruption. Pay attention. Our emotions do influence what happens on our communicative networks, and these audio and visual things that we do. We are more connected with our machines than you think. Our guest today is Rondi Lightmark. She has a master's degree in psychology from Saybrook University. She's has done a lot of feeling and investigating, and I've had the pleasure of understanding from her book, which here, what's the difference between stones and seeds, a lot about her emotional life, particularly her relationship with her deceased husband, Jim. She went to Saybrook Graduate School with an emphasis on consciousness research. Some of her professors were Stanley Krippner, Ruth Inge Heinz, Eugene Taylor, David Feinstein. She is also certified in family systems therapy of Bert Hellinger. She encourages you to connect with her teachers through the links in her bio in this post. This memoir of hers, Seeds and Stones, What's the Difference?, about the loss of her husband, Jim, won a Nautilus Book Award. It includes how her dream of becoming a writer was realized in connection with an extraordinary event in her home. This occurred on her return from a workshop with the spiritual philosopher David Spangler. Rhondi wants to make clear to you, our audience, her deep debt to her spiritual and other teachers, one of whom was the Austrian spiritual scientist Rudolf Steiner, and her time working as a writer in the spiritual education communities of Omega Institute and Esalen Institute. Welcome, Rhondi. Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. Glad to have you.
Thank you so much.
Well, why don't you tell us one of your coincidence stories? And I want to emphasize this book is full of a lot of feeling. And any of you going through grief, here's major grief reflected in these pages. And Rhondi has a message which I'm asking her to be able to tell us as she and as she ventures out into telling a first coincidence story.
So I actually want to start with a little bit of humor. When I was thinking of a title for this podcast, I talked about grief as it is often known in today's world as tragedy. And in my experience, which this book covers over the first year after losing Jim, was really from tragedy to revelation. And the revelation came through extraordinary dreams, through synchronicities, coincidences, and also through a recognition of Jim through humor. Jim was very funny. I tend to be rather silly myself. So this story took place about 9 months after Jim died. And I had been so validated through that time since he died in so many different ways. So my birthday came along, and I was pretty sure I was going to be validated on my birthday. I figured my friends would do something very special for me. Something somehow was going to be very special. But the day went by, and it seemed everyone was busy. And by the time it was evening, I had a little altar next to my bed, which was part of a very important ritual that I had every night before bed, which I'll share later. And so part of the ritual included first expressing any difficult emotions I had from the day. And I was feeling quite sorry for myself. So I sat down and talked about that. And then my black cat, Cinder, was, as I was agitating there, was rubbing against my back and purring over and over. And I was still too self-involved to really think about it. But eventually, as part of my process, I figured I was done, and I did some energy clearing. And then I looked down at my altar. And there in the very middle was a nice big fat mouse. Now, Cinder had never done anything like that before. There was no doubt in my mind that it was a little bit more of Jim's humor. And so I went to bed actually feeling pretty good.
How do you think that happened?
Well, as I've heard you say in your other podcasts and in my other experience, the animal world seems to resonate very much with the emotions of people who are feeling extreme emotion. And so in that case, it's particularly strange because Cinder was not a particularly affectionate cat, and did not even have a habit of bringing presence of dead animals into the house. So, or did not even sleep with me or particularly spend time in the bedroom. But I had gotten so used to many extraordinary experiences that there just was no doubt in my mind that Jim and the cat had gotten together and decided that that was what I needed, the gift of laughter for my birthday.
The main reason you wrote this book, although there are many, as I understand it, is because you want to let people know that it's possible to continue a relationship with a loved one who has died.
Yes, part of that influence came from two very important individuals in my life. One was an anthroposophical doctor, anthroposophy being the worldview of Rudolf Steiner, whose work was very much focused on exploring the supersensible world. And he strongly believed that the dead actually do, especially in the first year, need a relationship with those who have died. And so I was encouraged by that doctor to really take that into account. And I therefore developed my own spiritual practice, which I took on for nearly 3 years, but especially without fail the first year. So that was the first influence. And the other one was a Chinese doctor by the name of Wang Van Nguyen, not Chinese, he's Vietnamese. And he was is still quite an extraordinary man. His book is called Fourth Uncle in the Mountain. And he was a help to me and Jim while Jim was dying. And after Jim died, I went to see him, and just to say briefly about him, that he was an orphan who had been picked up in a marketplace by one of Vietnam's most famous spiritual teachers and barefoot doctors. And he had spent 7 years in a cave along the Cambodian border, deep in a cave, studying with a spiritual teacher. And his father, who had adopted him, left him there to be trained. And then he eventually ended up in Vermont. And so there was so much about him that was authentic. I felt he was an extraordinary person to guide me in my loss. So I went to see him after Jim died. And he said, now you need to let him go. And someday he'll come back to you. And I said, and he said, my father comes to me often, and I don't say anything. He's present. And so right now, it will be hard for him if you cling, but eventually you will experience him. So those two guides were pivotal in my deciding, because I had said to Jim while he was dying, he died of cancer. And I had just said to him already, you will, sorry, getting confused. We will still be married, but it will be different. And I did not mean that my life destiny was therefore going to be glued to his forever. I didn't really have that sense that our relationship was going to be frozen in stone, but that in some way our unusual and so important bond would find its way of continuing. And throughout my book, I do work very deeply into that question. So in terms of the reason for the book, I felt after Jim was gone, after the ceremonies were all over, I didn't really know how to grieve. And so I went up into my room and I made a little altar for myself, and I put Jim's picture on the altar, and I just sort of sat and looked at it. And it was a beautiful picture of him. He was an architect of a very wonderful Waldorf school, which is called the Pine Hill School in Wilton, New Hampshire. And the picture that I had of him was he was at the presentation of the foundation stone, which was a beautiful steel dodecahedron that had the wishes of the and prayers of the faculty and verses from the faculty inside. And his face is radiant and his hair is lit up by the sun. And so I was sitting there looking at this picture, and all of a sudden, just like it will in a movie, there was kind of like a shimmer across the picture. And all of a sudden, his expression turned to one of utter ecstasy. And it was so powerful that I gasped. And I felt as though I had been given a very brief glimpse of what he was experiencing. And I also, as I say in my book, I felt like I wasn't old enough to go to the party. You know, it was, it showed me a sense of what was possible. And from that point, then I thought, well, I don't really know how to grieve. And so here I had this altar, and I came to realize that there were two parts to the grief. And one was actually my struggle to deal with the shock and the loss. And so there were all my sort of sad feelings and fears for my future. I called it my poor me time. But then there was also the question of what had happened to Jim. Where was he? How was he? And so I created two parts for my grief. And the first part was I would be very quiet towards the rest of the day and for the end of each day. And then I would first sit there and just dump everything that I needed to dump. That was all my stuff from the day. And when I was finished, I would say, okay, that was about me, Jim. Now this is about you. And then I would close my eyes and I would focus on his face. And I would focus on my heart, because I could feel that my heart was very frozen. And there wasn't any point of sending him love if I didn't wake up my heart. So I really focused on waiting until I felt that love energy come into it, and so that I could take a breath. And then I would focus on sending a beam of light to him. And then when that energy had felt complete, then I would ask for help. And then I would give thanks. And I gave thanks because it was a way of saying, I don't know where I'm going. I don't know why this has happened, but I'm going to accept it, and I'm going to take on this journey, this spiritual journey that I'm on. And I would crawl into bed then, and I would sleep as though in the arms of angels, and I would have the most extraordinary dreams. And some of the dreams were about my stuff. They were pictures of my stuff trying to work itself out. And some of the dreams became about Jim, real contact with Jim. And so this was my process for, as I said, more than a year. And it really was a way of practicing acceptance, but it was also a way of practicing opening a channel, because clearly anyone who has lost a loved one the big lesson about the loss is a great tutorial about love. What I also came to understand was that there are three huge challenges for, and I've done some grief counseling and people agree that this is true. It's a body, those three challenges. It's a body challenge, a soul challenge, and a spirit challenge. And the body has a question: how am I going to not be killed by the grief? And my body was reflecting an enormous amount of the stress. It's not really talked about much in grief counseling, but that was a very important part for me, how I took care of my body. And the second part was a soul question that I was challenged with: who am I without Jim in my life? And the third part was, what is my infallible source of strength beyond all of this, which tied very much into who I am and what I needed to learn. So it was, I in my book, I tell it in 4 parts. And the first 3 parts look at those 3 challenges during that first year. And I wrote most of the book when I lost Jim nearly 30 years ago, and I was 48 at the time. So I kept a diary, and much of the book involves what I wrote about that time in a 48-year-old voice. And I was last year when the book was published, 76. I'm now 77. And so the last part is really kind of a summary of everything that I've become and learned since then, including some of the stories that still needed an ending and didn't get one in that first year.
One of the things you kind of mentioned just now, just as you were talking, you said that on page 129, the greatest gift someone could give you is their own death. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. When I met Jim, I had left my family and was on sabbatical in England for a year, studying at a Rudolf Steiner college. And forget where I was going with that. So yes, okay. So the reason that I was in England was because I really felt like I needed to grow up. I married at 18. I had 2 children right away. It was a very difficult marriage. I was working in a Waldorf school, and I was really starting to fall apart. And at that time, the faculty came up with the idea of sabbaticals, and I applied and was able to get one, which took me off to England. And during that time when I met Jim, I was still on the beginning of a great journey in terms of the question, do I really deserve to be here? And so the great journey after losing Jim was a constant confirmation that I do deserve to be here. And it came to a point where I still was waiting for confirmation, the ultimate confirmation from Jim. I had been doing my practice for months. I had had many experiences of contact from him, but I hadn't actually spoken and had him speak to me. And that's what I felt like I needed more than anything else. And so I had decided that I would take up a study of gardens and plants over the winter when it was so cold. And so I was doing this at Smith College, and I would listen to tapes of different spiritual teachers on the way back, driving back home. And I was listening to a Buddhist teacher who made that statement: the greatest gift anyone can give you is their own death. And I was overwhelmed when I heard it, because I realized how much I had grown and been strengthened, really, not weakened, but strengthened by the loss and by the love for Jim and the experience of Jim. And, someone had said to me as I shared some of my experiences, well, have you been angry yet? And I said, well, why should I be angry? Jim couldn't help that he died. So anyway, I got home. And by the time I got home, I actually realized that I was sick of being spiritual. I was overwhelmed with the sense of abandonment, and I was furious with Jim that he was gone. And so I ranted and raved and ignored my altar that night, and I cried myself to sleep. And then came an extraordinary dream. And I had been dreaming for a while about frozen rivers that I was visiting, but the ice was now melting. And in this dream, I was standing at the bottom of the hill that led up to the Waldorf School, where Jim had taken on an architectural project. And the snow was all melted, and there was a track going up there. And I followed the track, and I came to the top of the hill. And I saw in the distance the large building that was the main building. And Jim was coming out of the door, and his arms were piled high with bread. And he was crowing as if he was saying, look, I've finally got some food, because he had, of course, lost enormous amounts of weight with the cancer before he died. And I went right over to him and I said, put down the bread and give me a hug. And so he did, and he gave me a big, big hug and a big kiss. And then he led me over to a nearby hill, and we sat down, and I looked at him and I thought, I'm really, really here. Jim is really here. I'm really here. We are really together. And I could tell he was healing. He had a silk scarf, blue silk scarf around his head. I could see that the hair was growing in underneath it. He was wearing my favorite old red plaid shirt. And his face looked like someone does after they've been through a long illness. Very, very calm, somewhat excited, and just very beautiful. And we spoke a little bit. He was excited. He said, I'm already in the second angel's house, and there's going to be a big ceremony this weekend. And then I will be moved up again. And he had a very complicated and loving relationship with his mother. So I said, oh, you'll have to tell your mother. And he said, I don't know if she would really understand. And then he said, but what's the matter with you? You sound like you've been crying. And I said, oh, I'm just dealing with all of the things I wish I had done differently. And he kind of, got this, huh? It's like, and then he said, why? And it was as if he was saying, we said we were going to be connected. We've been connected. So I don't get where you're coming from. And I just looked and looked at him, and then the dream slowly faded, and I woke up feeling light as air. And I realized that the big, big block had been that I had been trying to make something happen And I hadn't fully dug deeply into all of the places that needed to be visited before it was really possible to experience all of Jim. And I hadn't even thought that here I was sending him all kinds of love every night, but I hadn't really thought that he was sending love to me. It was that he really was just as concerned about me as I was about him. So that was really the biggest confirmation of all, and probably the most important experience of all in that year.
And I think that's what you're saying about the greatest gift anyone can give you is their own death, is that you learn how to love, to feel love, which means one of the hardest things to do is not only to give love, which is if a person receives it, is a great honor, privilege. It's a wonderful thing to be able to love someone who receives it. But then the other part for some people is how difficult it is to receive love from the other person. So this giving and receiving of love seems to be something that is what you meant about death and its gift to the person who's living. Now, when you talk about love, you talk about it as if it's almost palpable, something that you not just feel and kind of feel your love, but there's a kind of there's an energy to it that you have to give. It's not just I love you. There's something that comes out of your heart as well as your mind that is love. Could you tell us the love that you're describing as best as you can, or what that is?
Well, it was a real challenge for me. I tend to love going inside my head and having all kinds of ideas. And that is something I love personally. I love um, the life of ideas and inspirations. Um, and I felt for me that love, and I still feel this, that there's so many different levels to love. And the experience of Jim definitely, and with other individuals in my life, that love can't be an idea. It has to be a practice. It has to be an experience. And for someone who likes ideas, the to go deeply into experience is something you have to sit still for. It's something you have to allow to take you in, and at the same time to be so very open to. And so I would say it's been a life lesson. Knowing Jim, being part of Jim's life, has been a life lesson about how to live my life in general with everyone I meet, with everything I bring now to my community, to my family, and to myself, if that makes sense.
It makes sense, generally speaking, that love is now an experience that you can continue to create with other people, community, family, and with yourself. Um, there's also, and this is a little off of what I had intended, but now it isn't. You also love your own ideas, it appears.
Yes, well, I would say, you wonder why. In my case, I sort of consider myself a bloomer. I didn't really finish college until after I married Jim. And then I went and got the master's degree because I really wanted to study consciousness. But I have certain books on my shelf that have been there just about my whole life. And I feel that they have something to do with who I am and with maybe questions I have still to solve. And I notice as I get older how things that seemed disparate are starting to link up with one another. So that's what I mean, I guess, about the life of ideas. It's a tremendous adventure. You certainly are an adventurer from what I can see. And it's wonderful to have something in your life that you recognize is really true to you, and to have all of these synchronicities that drop on you, or books that you look up at on your shelf and go, oh, there's a reason they're there. Yeah, it was when I was writing the book, I just about every chapter has a quote at the beginning, and those were all pieces that I had collected over the pretty much all of them were pieces that I'd collected over the years, that I know this has something to do with Jim or something to do with me. And so it's funny, when I wrote the book, in some ways I felt like I wasn't writing it alone. As I look back and read parts of it, I go, oh, well, that's a pretty good line. Was that really from you? But also to be so delighted to find that the pieces that I'd saved over the years fit into the puzzle of the book as I was creating it.
Yeah, that's a lot of fun. I'm writing a book now where that's happening. It's putting the pieces together in a tapestry that looks pretty. One of I want to emphasize one of the main reasons you've written this book, and even why you're continue to want to talk about it, why you contacted me to be on this podcast, why you contact other people, why you talk to other people and give talks, that you want others to know that you can maintain a relationship with someone who has died.
Yes, very much so. And I should say, after I had the very powerful dream about Jim, I went back to Wang, and it's an embarrassing story, but I'll tell it because I want to be clear about the relationship. I sat down with Wang and I said, well, Wang, I've finally seen Jim. This is my 48-year-old self. Maybe I wouldn't do this now, but I said, well, I've finally seen Jim, and now I'd like you to teach me how to see him more often. And Wang said, whoa, no. He said, no, if you were to do something like that and call Jim to you, it wouldn't be really Jim. And he said, I keep a knife under my pillow to chase away any bad spirits that come to me. And, I wasn't really shocked, because I recognized that what he was talking about was obsession. And he said, you let him come when he will, and basically leave it at that, right? So yes, I realized he was talking about obsession. And I also realized that, as I even had felt before when I said to Jim, we'll still be married, that the sense was that my life had its own path, his life had its own path, that his life would continue in some form after he died, his beingness or his spirit or his soul, or however we might say, and that I had a destiny also, but that there's also other ways to think about life after death. And one of the really beautiful quotes that I came across came from Guru Deva, who's a Hindu master, and it goes like this. He says, "Where is the land of the dead?" And he said, "Inside each of us, there is a world, and inside each that world is another world, and inside that world, another world, and inside that world, another world. And here's the thing: each world is bigger than the last. And when you get at last to the final world, that is the land of the dead." And really what he's saying is, we have it's for me, what he's really saying is, we have our constructions that we establish around who we think we are and what we think our world is. But the deeper you go into expanding your consciousness and letting that go, the more you can experience, until at last death isn't what we think it is. And in fact, we are connected to everything.
And that's one of your messages. But I think, at least as I listen to you, it's the ongoing relationship with Jim that is so profoundly telling about you and about him, and that he's still with you. And one of the questions that seems pretty obvious that you've answered before is that it's been 30 years, almost anyway, when you wrote the book, and you had the major portion of it as your 48-year-old, but you didn't write it then, I guess. Uh, you've now added this last part, and so you became a published writer. So what motivated you to write the last part with what you've learned from all this, and how did you become a published writer?
Well, when I was addressing that question, who am I without Jim in my life? I had been a faculty wife and involved in the Waldorf school system since I was 18 years old, but that was really not where my heart was. I loved to write. And so I thought, what am I going to do? I'm going to give myself 3 years to see if that dream can be fulfilled. So I was actually working. I had Silva mind control, has become very big again recently. Back then, I came across it, and I was doing some meditations and visualizations of the possibility of becoming a writer. And in fact, very quickly, through a faculty parent, I got an agent. I was working on a spiritual gardening book because I felt like I really needed to grow more before I could ever write about Jim. But I was still accumulating material over the years. And then after I, in the first year of the loss of Jim, about 7 months after he had died, it was the equinox, and I brought some girlfriends together, and we had a fire ceremony, and I told them I was beginning to feel like a phoenix. And about 2 or 3 weeks after that, I went off to a workshop led by the wonderful spiritual philosopher David Spangler. And as I was leaving my house, my wood stove was making a lot of noise. It was just cooling down from the night. And I banged on the stovepipe to make sure it wouldn't fall out of the wall. And I went off to my workshop. which was, as I said, it was wonderful. And when I got back home, my son was standing in the doorway and he said, "Mom, you wouldn't believe what happened while you were gone." And I said, why, what? And he said, I got here to spend the weekend and your wood stove was making a lot of noise and soot was puffing out of the cracks. And I opened the door and inside there was a live wild duck sitting on the ashes. And, our house was on a river and it was a merganser. Jim and I loved the mergansers. And, my jaw was on the floor and I said, "I know this is about Jim." And my son said, "There she is. She's on the riverbank." And so I ran over to the riverbank and the duck was there. And she just kind of seemed to take a look at me. And then she slipped into the river and, disappeared around a bend. And that was that. And then so I went to bed in a state of awe and I did go to sleep. And then I woke up in the middle of the night and I went, "Jim sent me a phoenix." And so I sat right up there and I wrote an open letter to him, which was basically saying, "Jim, I realized you sent me a phoenix. I figured it out." And I went on to say, I talked about the energy of the phoenix and how much love had come my way. And I sent the letter to the local paper. And right away, the reason I did that is I had been part of Jim and I were kindergarten teachers together. We shared a Waldorf kindergarten during our marriage. And so the whole community had been engaged in mourning in the loss of Jim. But after he died, I really needed my own space. So I had kind of disappeared on them. So I sent the letter to share with them as well. And so the newspaper offered me a column, and that column led to magazine work. And then through a series of extraordinary coincidences, I had already found an agent through, as I said, through a faculty member. And I met a woman who was a spiritual dog trainer at a dowsing conference as I was exploring my sensitivities, super sensible sensitivities. And the upshot was that my agent needed to talk to a dog trainer. And I brought her to meet this woman whose name was April Frost. And after she heard April Frost's story, she looked at me and she said, "This is a big book and you're going to write it." So I had never written a book before and had only been doing magazine work and not even that much of it. But ultimately, I got a $200,000 advance to write this book from with April Frost from Harmony Books, which was a division of Random House. And so the book came out 9 months later. It's called Beyond Obedience, Training with Awareness for You and Your Dog. And so that was just another extraordinary event. And along with that, my son was in Hollywood and wanting to working on seeing if he could break into screenwriting. So I called him and I said, "You wouldn't believe it. I just got this amazing advance to write a book." And he said, "Well, that's nothing. I just got $1 million to write a script." And then my daughter was out in Colorado and she was wanting to move back east and get into more horse. She was is a horse trainer and competitor, and she wanted to do more of the East Coast style writing rather than what was to be found out west. So as we were driving across, we drove across the country together. As we were driving, I was we were teaching her visualization, which I'd been doing with Silva Mind Control. So we visualized the perfect job, the people with money who were going to give her her own little house and great salary and horses to play with and health insurance. And we got to my house and the job was in the paper and she was hired immediately and it was in the same town as April Frost. So all three of us had life dreams realized in that year.
Those are pretty amazing stories, Rhondi. Those are pretty amazing stories. Uh, Advances like those don't happen every day, and imagining jobs, you got to be pretty good at coming up with the right thing to imagine so that you can run into it and notice it. And the three of you seem to be good at doing that. Now, how did you come to write Seeds and Stones?
Well, as I said, I'd been accumulating information and had actually started writing parts of the book, over the past 30 years. And when I hit 76, going on 77, I said it's now or never, basically. And so I have here on where I live on the island, I had when I first moved here, I got into photography and I decided my sense of humor needed some exercise instead of the grief work that I'd been doing. I'd been doing grief counseling and writing. And so I started a greeting card company featuring my images of dogs and cars and had been doing that. But then I sold that and I decided I wanted to work on the climate crisis. But in the midst of that, then I realized it was time to get this story told. So I just, backed off from a lot of my commitments. It was during the pandemic. I was very fortunate to, through a family member, be able to take a writing retreat. And because I had so much material already, I I was able to write it in about 3 or 4 months.
That's quite an accomplishment, but you had already laid the groundwork for that.
And as I
That's
say, I didn't feel like I wrote it alone either. It was kind of amazing how it evolved.
Who else was in on it?
Jim.
And how was he in on it? How did you experience him?
Well, um, I guess it was a sense of the flow, particularly. I did hire an editor to help me. I self-published the book. There's so many people now, men and women, but mostly women, writing their stories of loss, and there's some really beautiful stories out there. But the likelihood of it being published uh, in any kind of major or publisher or even minor publisher was not very big. So I self-published it, and I just felt like I was led from one opportunity to another in order to help bring it about. Um, I have I have family members in the spiritual worlds as well. As a matter of fact, as I was turning over in bed this morning, a penny hit the floor, and that's my mother's method of saying hello. So it. I feel like I had a community of helpers, but most specifically Jim.
We're coming to the end of our time together. I want to tell you a little bit about my experience with people who have departed this place. I'm able to just open my mind and say a name, and that person comes to me. I've had that communication with a deceased person I didn't know, but was the father of a friend of mine. And he told me things about her that she was surprised that I could know. So I've had contact that has tended to be not pennies or a mouse that's kind of indirect but symbolic, but there are actual verbal communications that sometimes are guidance, and sometimes, yeah, they're often guidance. When I have a little problem, I say, well, what might I do here? The 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 idea of being able to receive their love for me is what I've learned from you today, is that I need to be open up to that. So I'll ask you for a comment on what I've just said, and then we'll stop.
Well, I certainly know what you mean. And when I have things happen in my life, uh, I can kind of tell by the energy. It's maybe this isn't Jim. Maybe this is from mom. Maybe this is dad. Uh, maybe this is John, a man whom I was a caregiver for in New York for a time. Yes, it is a constant. I do feel very loved when that happens. I'm very loved. It's a wonderful and constant reminder that that loss is something, is a gift. It's a hard but important gift, especially because of that wonderful Guru Deva quote. It's it's not separate. We're not separate. I think there's a big difference between consciousness and awareness, and I think that consciousness is in some way more verbal and abstract, and awareness is more pictorial and symbolic. And I think that a lot of the experiences that I have had were more in the realm of awareness, being in that state of awareness. And that is really where the real truths and gifts lie.
Well, I think that's a wonderful summation of much of what you've learned. And you've told us many other things that are, I think, going to be useful to those people who watch and listen to us. So thank you very much, Rhondi, for being on the show with me. And I hope more people get to hear your message about we can keep connections and be able to know how, for that individual person, those connections might be maintained.
Thank you very much.
This psychosphere is our mental atmosphere, like a hologram of cosmic consciousness.